The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 13th chapter. Glory to you, O Lord. As Jesus came out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones and what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." When he was sitting opposite the Mount of Olives, opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately, "Tell us, when will this be? And what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished?" Then Jesus began to say to them, "Beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, 'I am he,' and they will lead many astray. When you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is still to come. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs." The Gospel of the Lord. So, throughout his earthly ministry, it seems that Jesus became famous as a teacher and as a healer and even as a miracle worker. But in spite of the fact that he was always on the road, he was never famous as a travel blogger. And today's Gospel makes it clear why that was. Jesus and his disciples have arrived in Jerusalem, and they go up onto the Temple Mount. Just a couple of decades before, Herod the Great had vastly expanded the footprint of the Temple Mount by hauling in 40-ton cut stones to build these massive retaining walls, which then got backfilled. So it created a platform for the whole area of the temple larger than anyone ever imagined could be made. The temple building itself had been renovated and enlarged, and people from all over the Roman Empire came to see this impressive sight, even if they had no particular connection to Judaism. And while in Mark's Gospel, the disciples are generally portrayed as clueless and usually wrong about stuff, this time they're right. Those stones are large. The buildings were impressive, even by Roman standards, and even though the Romans later completely destroyed the temple building, and the retaining wall, however, and the Temple Mount are still there today. When you go there and you take the tour, they point out that these stones are cut so precisely, they fit together, they hold together with no mortar. So if you've seen the pictures of the Wailing Wall, that's what the Wailing Wall is. It's the retaining wall. People try to stick pieces of paper between them. They're that tight. They are still impressive. But in today's gospel reading, Jesus throws cold water on all of it. "Do you see these great buildings?" Jesus asks. "They'll all be thrown down." I mean, travel bloggers aren't supposed to say that. And later in the evening, when the disciples ask him to explain this, things sound even worse. Wars and rumors of wars are coming. Famines, earthquakes. Beware that you are not led astray. Now, in some ways, it's not terribly prophetic to predict that eventually buildings will fall down. Almost all will, given enough time. And it's not particularly prescient to predict that wars and rumors of wars will come. That also happens still today with sad regularity. And people have tried and still try to lead others astray in a variety of ways. Beware is not a new warning. But then, Jesus goes on to say something that seems to make absolutely no intuitive sense. After telling his disciples about all of these terrible and scary things, he says, "Do not be alarmed." Do not be alarmed. Really? How can we not be alarmed by all of these things? Because after all, we still hear about all this kind of stuff today. Wars, rumors of wars, earthquakes, famines, they're all over the place. And we're always told when we hear about these things that we should be alarmed. In fact, it often feels like we live in a constant state of alarm. We are repeatedly told that we should be alarmed, and often there are good reasons for that. Sometimes they're good and sometimes they're bad, but it is the case that politicians on both sides tell us that we should be alarmed by the outrageous and crazy stuff that somebody on the other side said or did, or might do or say in the future. In some ways, I get it, because in a country where barely more than half of us vote, if my side can get alarmed enough, it might drive up the voter turnout. And so we're always told that we're supposed to be alarmed. We're told that we should be alarmed by our news feeds, which lead with stories about all of the things that should shock and alarm us. The latest war, outrage, tragedy, or example of corruption. I mean, it's good that we know about all of these things, but we also know that they are clickbait. They drive views and advertising revenue. And so there's always a financial incentive to tell people what they should be alarmed about. And sometimes, even charitable organizations depend upon people being alarmed by suffering and injustice. You know, I really like the work that the ELCA Disaster Relief Fund does. They do great stuff in the United States and throughout the world. But they always, I always get emails from them called disastergrams. And they always want to tell you there's the latest disaster going on, as though I didn't know this already from reading the news, and how it is really important that I give right this moment. And their stuff is good. But I also realize that for many charitable organizations, it seems that alarming people is also a good fundraising strategy, because if you can alarm people enough, well, then maybe they'll give. And yet, the thing about living in a constant state of alarm is that it is distracting from everything else that's going on around you. It's exhausting, and it saps the emotional energy you have to engage on any issue. And it's demoralizing, because many of these alarming messages portend that if you are not constantly alarmed enough, the world as you know it will literally end. And yet, in the midst of all of this, Jesus says, do not be alarmed. And when he says that, he doesn't say, don't pay attention to the problems of the world. He doesn't say, don't care about the suffering of others. And he doesn't even say, don't take reasonable precautions to avoid danger to your life. Because if you continue reading chapter 13, he goes on later and says, and when this happens, be aware that you may have to flee and go someplace to protect yourself. I mean, Jesus is all upfront about this. But in telling his first disciples and telling us not to be alarmed, Jesus is calling us to be people who do not get so distracted by the crisis du jour that we are unable to see or focus on what God is calling each of us to do in this particular place and in this particular moment. The disciples in today's reading have followed Jesus into Jerusalem at the beginning of what we call Holy Week. It is the time when they are about to be involved in the next few days in the death and the resurrection of Jesus, and to be sent into the world with that good news. But at the moment, they're distracted by what's going to happen with the temple and the signs that this might happen. Don't be alarmed means don't miss out on what God is doing with you in your life right now, and how God is calling you to make a difference in this moment. Because long before they get to the other stuff, Jesus has work for his disciples to do right where they are and right now. And don't be alarmed means don't be distracted so that you don't do the important things that I'm calling you to do right now. I mean, it's true for me, and maybe it's true for you too, that when I'm stewing too much about the big headlines of the day, which frankly most of them I can't do anything about, I lose focus on what God may be calling me to do or to notice right here and right now. When Jesus calls his first disciples, and he calls us not to be alarmed, he's calling us to be people who resist becoming exhausted by the constant drama and trauma that the world always feeds us. Jesus always called his disciples, and he calls us to help those who are suffering in the world around us and in our own neighborhoods. But there will always be more than we can do, and our efforts will, frankly, often seem insignificant. That's why it's good to remember that Jesus saves the world, not us. And that can free us to use the energy and the abilities God gives us to make a difference, even if just for one other person, instead of exhausting our energy in a constant state of alarm. And when Jesus calls us to not be alarmed, he's calling us to remember that the alarming thing that is going on around us, whether it's social, political, or my own personal trauma, is not actually the end. This, whatever this is, may be bad and painful and even seem like the end. But Jesus promises us that the end of all things is finally in God's hands. The end is when God brings about a new world where there are no more alarming things. And even the end for us is not death, but new life. Jesus told his first disciples that the temple was coming down, wars, rumors of wars, famines, earthquakes, all those other things, they would not be the end. And it wasn't. God had more to come. And God has more to come for us as well. And when we know that this is not the end, we're able to engage in whatever alarming thing happens to us or to our world without losing hope. Do not be alarmed, Jesus says, because God really is doing something with you and around you that's worth noticing. Do not be alarmed, says Jesus, because if you do, you'll end up wasting your energy on the trauma and the drama instead of on the things that really make a difference. And do not be alarmed, says Jesus, because as bad as things may seem, this is not the end. And in the end, when the end actually does come, the end is in God's hands. And God's end for you and for the whole world is the reality of resurrection and new life.